Okay, we're here today for Chapter 17, Section 2, which is going to talk about how the Renaissance movement expands into parts of Northern Europe. One of the big reasons why the North experienced the Renaissance was due to an increase in the population. By the year 1450, the population began to rebuild in the aftermath of the Great Plague. Also, we had the Hundred Years' War, which involved England and France coming to an end in 1453, and this helped increase the numbers in European cities. Also, a region called Flanders, which is basically modern day Belgium, became a major epicenter of the Renaissance movement. Artwork, in capital letter B, talks about the fact that England and France were unified under very strong kings, which was different from how things worked in the Italian city-states. Eventually, those rulers and monarchs became patrons of the arts. For example, Francis I of France hired Leonardo da Vinci to do portraits and other work. Artists of the Northern Renaissance were especially interested in what we call realism. They wanted to portray their subjects in a realistic fashion. Now, Roman numeral 2 is going to focus on the spread of ideas. One reason why, again, the Renaissance ideas and ideologies expanded northward was due to a war. In 1494, a war in southern Italy eventually spread into northern Italy and caused many of the Renaissance artists that were living there to move out of that region. They brought with them, of course, the styles and techniques of the Italian Renaissance. And this is kind of where Germany and Flanders and France started to blossom. Some of the German painters and artists were Albrecht Durer, who focused on realism. He produced woodcuts and engravings, and oftentimes in his paintings portrayed religious subjects. You also had Hans Holbein, who specialized in doing realistic paintings of portraits. One of his famous works was of Henry VIII, who was the King of England. Then, as we talked about with modern-day Belgium, we had some Flemish painters from the region of Flanders. This was really the center of artistry in Northern Europe. You have some work by Johann van Eyck, who specialized in oil-based paints. Actually, he kind of really pioneered oil-based painting. And then you also have Peter Bruegel the Elder, who specialized in doing large crowds of people, weddings, dances, harvests, etc. I would like to show you some of the works of these figures here that we're talking about. Here's Albrecht Durer and the praying hands right there. You have, of course, Jan van Eyck, a couple of key religious moments here, but you can see with oil-based paint, the bright color is really characterized there. You have Peter Bruegel the Elder. This is the Peasant's Wedding, a famous painting by him. So those are just a few examples of some of the artwork that we're discussing here today. Okay, next we're going to talk about writing, and we're going to focus on how Northern writers attempted to reform society. A lot of the influential writers during this time period were known as Christian humanists. They focused on changing and reforming society. They believed that education was really important. Humanists actually wanted to educate women as well. So that was kind of a new movement. One key humanist was named Desiderius Erasmus. He was from Holland. He believed in a Christianity of the heart, not really one of ceremonies and rules. He also believed that all people should study the Bible to improve society. So studying of the Bible was extremely important to the early Christian humanists. Another Christian humanist was Sir Thomas More. He wrote a book called Utopia, and a utopia is actually an ideal place. So he focused on sort of the struggles of society, and he wanted to get people into a place where it was talking about what is ideal, a lack of greed, a lack of war, things of that nature would exist in a utopia or a perfect society. In the book, the utopia is an imaginary land where greed, corruption, and war do not exist. Also, money is unnecessary because greed doesn't exist. So very different look at how life could possibly work in that book. Women's reforms during this time, the vast majority of Europeans were actually illiterate. They were unable to read or write during the Middle Ages. Families that could afford education usually only sent their sons to be educated. An example of a woman who was educated and did very well was Christine de Pizan. She was an educated woman that earned her living as a writer. She actually, in her writing, challenged the male objection to educating women. She wrote a very famous book called The Book of the City of Ladies, and there is a primary source about this in your textbook on page 482. Her goal was actually the formal education for children of both sexes or genders. Next, we'll take a look at Roman numeral 4, talking about the Elizabethan age, which is how the idea of the Renaissance spreads into England. Now, that happened around the 1500s. Queen Elizabeth was ruling during that time. She ruled from 1558 to 1603. She was extremely well educated, multilingual. I think she spoke 7 languages fluently. She wrote poetry and music. She also danced. She also was a part of athletics. So she contributed to the Renaissance in many ways. A famous playwright during this time was William Shakespeare, probably the most famous writer of the Elizabethan age. Many regard him as the most famous playwright of all time. He was born in 1564 in a small town near London, and his plays include both tragedies and comedies. Oftentimes, they focus on human flaws. Finally, for the importance of today, we're going to talk about the printing press and how it spread Renaissance ideas. One thing we have to do is give credit to the Chinese. The Chinese actually invented printing. They invented what's called wood block printing. You basically place ink on a wooden block stamp and then press it onto paper. Eventually, a craftsman from Germany, what is modern day Germany, named Johann Gutenberg, developed a printing press that actually incorporated a number of technologies in a new way. He started to work on this project in 1440, but it actually wasn't until 1453 that he had completed the work. In 1455, he actually produced the first entire book, which is known as the Gutenberg Bible. So the first book created in the Gutenberg printing press was the Bible. The printing press actually enabled a printer to produce hundreds of copies of a single work. This mass production made books cheap enough for many to afford. This makes books more available, right? And so then this increases education. Now even more poor folks who couldn't necessarily get a true education by a tutor or a teacher or in some type of private setting could now at least sort of have access to books and could eventually learn to read. Now, a copyist, where people write everything down by hand like monks in monasteries, they could produce about 1 book in 5 months, whereas one man and a printing press could produce 500 books in a month with the machine. So that is a major difference that we need to take into account. And then at the end here, it talks about the legacy of the Renaissance. There are some things listed about the changes in the arts on page 485, and also the changes in society on page 485. And I'll show you what some of those things look like in a second. But first of all, here's the printing press. This is kind of how it looked. There's a template that you put all of the letters for a certain page on. Then you slap the ink on that. And then you can see how you crank this part down to press it onto a piece of paper. So you would make 500 page ones, for example. Then you change your template out to whatever's on page 2 and then press out 500 page 2s. That's basically how you're utilizing the printing press. Okay, on page 485, you can see that there are some bulleted lists that often talk about the changes that happened with art and then also the changes to society during the Renaissance. So this is a really important reference page here in your textbook. Thank you.